The first thing you need to know is that Sable Ashby did not go looking for the truth. The truth came looking for her, slipping through a mail slot on a gray November morning in Brooklyn, landing on top of a pile of overdue notices and rejection letters that had been gathering on the entryway floor for weeks. But we are not starting there. We are starting 3 weeks later, in the middle of a storm in a house that smelled of old pine and older secrets. Sable stood in the kitchen of a house she had never lived in, holding a flashlight with both hands, her boots leaving muddy prints on floorboards that had not felt the weight of a living person in months. Bryn stood beside her, 10 years old and wide awake, despite the hour, her small fingers wrapped around her mother's forearm. At their feet, 5 tin boxes wrapped in wax paper sat arranged in a row on the kitchen floor, the way a careful person arranges things when they want to make sure nothing is forgotten. Rowan, their 11-year-old golden retriever, was not looking at the boxes. He was looking at the window. His ears were flat against his skull, and the sound coming from his throat was low and continuous, the kind of sound that does not mean he heard a raccoon outside. Sable said very quietly, "There's someone out there." Bryn did not ask how she knew. She had already seen it too. 3 weeks earlier, the apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in Carroll Gardens smelled like radiator heat and the particular staleness of rooms where not enough happens anymore. The staircase creaked on the 7th step the way it had always creaked. The window above the kitchen sink looked out onto a narrow alley where someone had been growing tomatoes in a bucket for 3 summers running, and every September the tomatoes turned red and no one ever picked them. Sable Ashby had lived here for 14 years, first with her husband Daniel, then without him. Daniel had been dead for 3 years. He had died on a Tuesday afternoon in the produce section of the Associated Supermarket on Smith Street, his heart stopping without drama or warning while he was deciding between 2 varieties of winter squash. The paramedics said he was gone before he hit the floor. Sable had been at work when it happened, helping a retired schoolteacher locate a large print edition of a John Steinbeck novel, and she did not find out until she came home and found a uniformed officer sitting in her building's vestibule. She had kept working at the Parkside Library for 2 years after that, because the work gave structure to days that would otherwise have been shapeless. She had kept working until there was no library left to work at the budget cut announced in a memo from the city in late August, the doors closing for the last time on a Friday afternoon in September, while Sable stood on the sidewalk outside and watched a colleague she had known for 20 years lock up and walk away without looking back. Since then, there had been interviews. 11 of them. The most recent had ended with a polite woman at a bookstore on Atlantic Avenue saying with genuine regret in her voice that they were looking for someone with more experience in digital marketing. Sable had nodded and thanked her and walked the 12 blocks home in the rain because she did not want to spend $4 on a subway ride she could not afford. The morning the letter arrived, she was standing at the kitchen counter, drinking black coffee and watching Bryn's bedroom door, waiting for the sound that would mean her daughter was awake. The coffee was from a can that had been on sale. The electricity bill on the counter had a red border around it, which was the utility company's way of communicating urgency without actually having a conversation. The knock at the front door came at 8:15. Mrs. DeLuca was 62 years old and had owned the building for 23 of them. She was not an unreasonable woman. She had extended Sable's deadline twice already, both times with the brisk efficiency of someone who understood that kindness was not the same as indefinite patience. She stood in the doorway in a housecoat and reading glasses, holding a folded piece of paper, the way a person holds something they have prepared in advance, because they know the conversation will be difficult. "Miss Ashby," she said, "this is the formal notice. I've been patient. I've extended twice. 2 more weeks and I have to start the process." Sable looked at the paper. She had known this was coming. Knowing something is coming and experiencing it arriving are two entirely different things, and for a moment she felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding something heavy for too long and has finally run out of places to set it down. "I understand," she said. She closed the door, stood in the dim hallway with her back against it. Bryn appeared in the doorway of her bedroom. She was wearing pajamas with small yellow stars on them, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, holding a stack of drawings she had made the night before. She looked at her mother's face and did not ask what was wrong. She simply walked over and stood beside her close enough to be felt. That was the moment the letter appeared, not dramatically, not with any sense of fate or ceremony. Bryn crouched down and picked it up from the pile on the floor, turning it over in her hands, examining the gold-embossed seal on the front flap. "Mum," she said, "there's a gold seal on this one." The letter was from an office called Blackwell and Associates Attorneys at Law in Richmond, Virginia. It was addressed to Sable Ashby by full name at her Brooklyn address. The language was formal and dry, the kind of language that lawyers use precisely because it contains no room for emotion. It informed her that one Mabel Weston had passed away at the age of 88, and that Sable had been named the sole heir to a property located in Blue Ridge County, Virginia, described as a 2-story residence on approximately 12 acres along Hollow Creek Road. Sable read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Mabel Weston, the woman her parents had always referred to obliquely, in lowered voices, as a kind of cautionary presence at the edge of the family, the odd one, the one who had her reasons. Sable had visited the property once when she was 8 years old, a single summer week that she remembered in fragments, the smell of pine resin and cold water, the sound of a creak somewhere behind the house, the way a very old woman's hands moved when she was brushing dust from the spines of leather-bound books. Then the visit stopped and no explanation was offered, and eventually Sable stopped asking. Bryn was looking up at her. "Are we rich now?" "No," Sable said. "We inherited a house in the mountains." "Is that good?" Sable folded the letter carefully and put it in the pocket of her cardigan. "I don't know yet," she said. 3 days later she sat across from Roe Forden at the First National branch on Montague Street. Forden was 55 years old, with a gray suit and the habit of looking at his laptop screen during conversations in a way that suggested he considered direct eye contact an inefficient use of his attention. He had reviewed the property description that Sable brought in along with her other financial documents, and he set it aside on the corner of his desk with the practiced motion of someone placing something in the low priority section. "The property has no assessed market value to speak of," he said, still looking at his screen. "These rural mountain parcels often have structural liabilities that exceed the land value. Bringing a home like that up to current code can cost more than the property itself is worth." He paused, then reached into his desk drawer and set a business card on the surface between them. "I know of a party with interest in that area. they've indicated a willingness to make a fair offer. Sable picked up the card. It read Crow Development Corp., Blue Ridge County, Va. Regional Acquisitions. She turned it over, blank on the back. Why, she said, would a development company be interested in a property you just told me has no market value? Forden reached for the card. He was a fraction of a second faster than a person reaches for something they intended to leave on the table. He returned it to his drawer without answering. Sable looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her documents and put them back in her folder. "I'll be in touch," she said, which was something people say when they have decided not to be in touch. She took the subway home and sat at the kitchen table with Bryn doing homework beside her, and she looked at the letter from the lawyers, and then at the stack of overdue notices, and then out the window at the November sky, which was the specific shade of gray that a sky becomes when it has been overcast so long it has forgotten what it looked like before. She made a decision the way a person makes a decision when all the other options have already been exhausted. They left on a Wednesday morning, just after dawn, the Honda Civic loaded with one suitcase, a box of canned food, a sleeping bag, two flashlights, and Roan, who climbed into the back seat without being asked, and settled his graying muzzle on Bryn's lap with the dignity of an old dog who has learned that wherever the people go, that is where he goes too. The drive south and west unfolded through 3 states. The city gave way to New Jersey, then to Pennsylvania, then to Virginia, where the hills began, and the highway narrowed, and the trees grew taller and closer to the road. By early afternoon the GPS had found the edges of its confidence, and by mid-afternoon it had lost them entirely. Sable drove on printed directions from the lawyer's office. Landmarks became increasingly approximate. An abandoned gas station, a fork past an old mill, a wooden bridge that trembled when she drove over it. At the last gas station, before the road began to climb in earnest, she stopped to fill the tank. The man pumping gas at the adjacent island was perhaps 55, wearing a camouflage jacket and work boots with the compact, weathered look of someone who had spent most of his adult life outside. He glanced at the New York plates, glanced at the printed directions in Sable's hand, visible through the open window. He read the words Hollow Creek Road, and something shifted in his expression that was not quite recognition and not quite warning, and not quite either of those things. He did not say anything. He shook his head once slowly and walked back to his truck without looking at her again. Sable watched him go. She noted it, the way you note a flicker of movement at the edge of your vision, not enough to stop you, but enough to stay with you. The rain started an hour later. It came in the way mountain rain comes in autumn, not gradually, but all at once, as though a door had opened somewhere above the clouds. The windshield wipers worked at their maximum speed and still could not keep the glass entirely clear, offering a stroboscopic view of a road that grew narrower with each passing mile, the trees pressing in from both sides, their branches sweeping against the roof of the car. Bryn had been quiet for the last hour, watching the world change outside her window with the focused attention of a child who understands that what she is seeing is not like anything she has seen before. "Mom," she said. "I know," Sable said. The tire blew out on a section of road so narrow that when the car pulled sharply to the right, the passenger side mirror brushed the underbrush at the road's edge. Sable got the car stopped. The engine made a sound it had not made before, and then smoke began rising from under the hood in thin gray tendrils, and she understood that it was not only the tire. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel. She did not allow herself the full weight of the moment. There was a child in the back seat, and an aging dog, and a storm that was not going to stop, and allowing herself the full weight of the moment was a luxury she could not afford. She lifted her head, looked at the road in both directions, and tried to think practically. The headlights came around the bend behind them before she had finished thinking. The truck was old and blue, a Ford from the early 90s with one slightly dented passenger door and a bumper sticker so faded the words were no longer readable. It slowed alongside them, and the driver's window came down, letting in a gust of cold, wet air. The man behind the wheel was in his early 70s, with a face that had been shaped by decades of outdoor living into something that suggested less aging than geology. He wore a faded olive-green baseball cap that had been washed many times, and he had a neat gray beard and eyes that assessed the situation in front of him with the quiet efficiency of someone who has seen many situations and has learned that the important things become clear quickly if you pay attention. "You folks having trouble?" he said. It was not quite a question. "The tire went," Sable said, "and I think something's wrong with the engine." "I can see the engine," he said. "Where are you headed?" "Hollow Creek Road. I'm trying to find the Western property." Something happened in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular expression a person has when a thing they have been expecting finally arrives. "You must be Sable," he said. She stared at him. "Mabel mentioned you," he said. "I'm Stellan Granger. I live about 2 miles down from the property. I used to help your great-aunt with repairs from time to time." He paused. "That car isn't going to make it up the mountain road, even if we fix the tire tonight. Why don't I give you folks a lift? We can come back for your things when the storm passes." Sable looked at him for a long moment. She had spent most of her adult life in a city where you assessed strangers quickly and kept your guard up as a matter of habit. But there was something in the way Stellan Granger looked at her steady and patient, and without any quality of performance, that made the calculation come out differently than it usually did. She got out of the car, in the truck with the heater running, and Roan wedged between Bryn and the door. The road climbed steeply into a landscape that the headlights only partially revealed. Ancient trees stood on both sides like sentinels in the dark. The rain moved in sheets across the windshield. Bryn, who could go from quiet to direct without warning, said, "Did you fight in a war, Mr. Granger?" Stellan kept his eyes on the road. "Vietnam," he said. "Special Forces." "Did you know my great-great-aunt before you went?" A pause that lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was enough of a pause to contain something. "We grew up in the same county," he said. "She was a few years older than me. When I enlisted, she was the only one who wrote consistently." Bryn considered this. What did she write about? Stellan's hands shifted slightly on the wheel. She wrote about the birds she could see from her kitchen window. She'd tuck a little list into each envelope, the kinds of birds she'd spotted that week and where she'd seen them. A pileated woodpecker on the east ridge, a pair of indigo buntings at the feeder. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know why it worked, but every time I read one of those lists, I remembered that somewhere the world was still operating normally, that there were still places where the most dramatic thing happening was a woodpecker on a ridge. Bryn was listening with her whole body, the way children listen when they have recognized that something true is being said. "Did she know it helped you?" she asked. Stellan did not answer immediately. No, he said finally, I never told her. The weight of those 4 words settled into the cab of the truck and stayed there. The house came out of the rain and the darkness all at once and completely. 2 stories of dark wood and native stone vines climbing the wall beside the front door, the porch roof sagging at one end under the weight of accumulated seasons. The windows were dark and the yard was deep in shadow, but the structure itself had a quality of permanence, of something built to withstand more than one storm. Stellan helped them carry the essentials inside. He showed Sable the circuit breaker, the well pump, the emergency supplies Mabel had kept organized in a back closet with the thoroughness of someone who had lived alone long enough to understand that preparation is not pessimism, but respect for reality. He showed her how to start the generator in the small shed behind the house, walking her through the sequence once, then stepping back. Sable pulled the cord. Nothing. Pulled again. A weak cough. On the third pull, using the motion he had demonstrated, the machine shuddered and caught settling into a low, persistent rumble. There, Stellan said, every woman should know how to start her own power. Inside, Bryn had found a kerosene lamp and figured out how to light it on her own, setting it on the kitchen table with a satisfaction that was visible from across the room. Stellan built a fire in the stone hearth in the main room. The wood caught quickly, and the light changed the character of the space, the dancing shadows, making the old furniture and the crowded bookshelves seem less abandoned and more merely waiting. He stayed for an hour, answering Sable's questions about the house, about Mabel, about the property lines, and the water source, and the quirks of the electrical system, but there was a quality to his answers, a careful completeness that felt slightly rehearsed, as though he was giving her everything she asked for, and nothing more than that. When Bryn had finally gone upstairs, exhausted and unwilling to admit it, Sable poured 2 mugs of instant coffee and set one in front of Stellan and asked the question she had been waiting to ask. You knew why she lived up here alone for 60 years, Sable said. You knew why my family stopped coming after I was 8. You knew something. Why didn't you tell anyone? Stellan wrapped both hands around his mug. He looked at the fire for a long time before he spoke. Because she asked me not to, he said. She had her reasons for everything, and I had made her a promise. Not about any specific thing, just the general kind of promise you make to someone when you understand that they have chosen a hard path and you are not going to be the one to make it harder. What promise? He stood up then and moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her, and what she saw in his face in that moment was not evasion, but something heavier and more complicated, the expression of a man who has carried something for a long time and is not yet sure how to put it down. I told her I'd come back from Vietnam and do the right thing, he said. I came back, but by the time I got here, the right thing had a different shape than I'd expected, and I never told her that I understood why she'd made the choices she made. He paused. That's what I couldn't give back to her, the knowing. I went out into the rain, and the sound of his truck faded up the mountain road, and Sable stood in the doorway, listening until there was nothing left to hear. She was still thinking about what he had said 2 hours later, when she finally decided to sleep. She went upstairs and looked in on Bryn, who was unconscious with the total commitment of a 10-year-old who has spent a day of maximum experience, and she stood for a moment in the doorway of the room that had been Mabel's, feeling the accumulated weight of decades in the particular silence of a space where someone has lived alone for a very long time. On the bedside table was a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, its spine cracked from many readings. She picked it up without thinking about it, the way you pick up a book in someone else's house. It fell open near the beginning. In the margin beside one particular sentence, someone had made a small mark in pencil, and beside the mark in handwriting that Sable did not yet recognize, but would come to know well, were three words, or until they're gone. She set the book down carefully as though it were fragile. She slept. She was asleep when Rowan started. The sound came into her dreams first as something else, a door in an unfamiliar house, a car alarm, 2 streets over. Then it resolved into what it actually was, Ron's low, continuous warning, the sound he made for threats rather than curiosity, and she was awake before she had consciously decided to wake. She lay still for 3 seconds, listening. The house had its own sounds at this hour, the settling of old wood, the wind working at the corners of the eaves, but under all of that Ron's sound continued, pointed and directional, aimed at something specific. She got up without turning on a light, moved to the window. The storm had softened during the night to a steady, quiet rain. The yard was dark, except for the pale glow that the cloud cover reflected back down from the valley lights far below. The tree line was a black mass at the edge of the clearing. 40 meters into those trees a small orange light glowed, steady, unmoving, the lit end of a cigarette held by someone who was not walking or working, but simply standing there looking at the house. She watched it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it went out as deliberately as it had been lit. She stood at the window for a long time after her reflection, faint in the glass, her heartbeat not quite steady. Someone knew they were here. Someone had come to look. She had not yet opened the boxes. She did not know yet what they contained or what they meant. She knew only that a development company had tried to buy this property before she had even arrived, that a man in a camouflage jacket had recognized the name of this road and shaken his head, and that whatever Mabel Weston had kept in this house for 60 years, someone else already knew it was here and had been waiting to see who came for it. She went back to bed. She did not sleep again until nearly dawn. When morning came, gray and damp and quiet, Breen was already downstairs. She had been exploring since first light, with the systematic thoroughness of a child who treats a new environment as a research project. And when Sable came down the stairs, she found her daughter sitting on the kitchen floor in front of the large wardrobe in the corner, with Rowan beside her, his nose pressed to the base of the furniture. "I keep smelling this," Bryn said. "Dogs smell things," Sable said. "No, Mom, look at the wood." Sable crouched down. Bryn was right. The lower panel of the wardrobe's base was subtly different from the surrounding wood, the grain running at a slightly different angle, the edge not quite flush with the frame it was set into. Sable pressed it lightly with 2 fingers, and felt it give just a little. She went to the desk in the corner and found a letter opener. She worked it carefully into the small gap at the panel's edge and applied steady, gentle pressure until something clicked and the panel swung inward on hinges that had been oiled within living memory. Behind it was a narrow cavity, cool and dark, smelling of cedar and thyme. She reached in. She brought out 5 tin boxes wrapped in wax paper, set them on the kitchen floor in a row. Her hands were not entirely steady. Bryn sat cross-legged beside her and watched without speaking, which was something Bryn almost never did. The first box held money, bundles of bills from the early 1960s, tied with faded ribbon, each bundle held together with the careful precision of someone who understood that these were not her funds to spend. The second box held gold coins and a savings passbook from a bank that no longer existed. The third box held a ledger. Handwritten in small precise script, it documented transactions in the summer of 1963. On the left side of each entry, a name of family, a dollar amount with the heading allocated. On the right, a second dollar amount under the heading received. The two columns never matched. Beside each entry in a different pen were initials CC. The fourth box held newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile. Relief funds missing. Treasurer disappears. Community betrayed. The main photograph showed a young woman of perhaps 28, dark-haired, with a direct, serious gaze. The caption beneath it read, "Mabel Weston, former treasurer of the Blue Ridge Flood Relief Committee, has not been seen since August 14." Sable looked at the photograph for a long time. She recognized the eyes. She had seen them in the mirror every morning of her adult life and never known why they felt familiar. The fifth box was smaller than the others. It held a single envelope. Her name was written on the front in handwriting that was elegant and careful, and had been made by hands that had long since stilled. Sable Ashby, not Miss Sable Ashby, not dear Sable, just her name written as though the person writing it had said it to themselves many times before ever writing it down. She broke the seal. The letter was one page written, front and back, and she read it through once quickly and then again slowly, and by the time she finished the second reading, her hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Mabel had not stolen the money. She had taken it from men who were going to steal it, men who had already begun the process of stealing it, redirecting relief funds meant for flood victims into shell companies and favorable land deals, purchasing ruined properties from desperate families for fractions of their worth. She had discovered the discrepancies in her role as treasurer, had confronted the committee chairman, had offered him the chance to correct the record before she went public. He had offered her a percentage to stay quiet. When she refused, he had made clear what refusal would cost her. So she made a choice that could not be undone. She took the money out of his reach and disappeared into the mountains, becoming in the process exactly the villain he had accused her of being, because the alternative was to leave the funds in the hands of men who would use them to build an empire on the grief of people who had already lost everything. "Trust Stellan Granger," the letter said. "He knows more than he may initially reveal, but his loyalty has never wavered." And there was one more thing, a name. Culver Crow, the chairman of the Relief Committee in 1963. A young businessman who had in the 60 years since become the wealthiest and most influential man in Blue Ridge County. A man with a son named Fletcher, who currently served as county attorney. A man whose development company had tried through a banker in Brooklyn to buy this property before Sable had even reached the Virginia state line. Sable set the letter down on the kitchen floor. Bryn had been reading over her shoulder for the last paragraph, and when Sable looked at her, Bryn's face had the expression of someone processing something large. "So she wasn't a thief," Bryn said. "No, she let everyone think she was, to protect the money from the people who actually wanted to steal it." Yes, Bryn thought about this for a moment with the visible deliberateness that characterized her best thinking. "That means she gave up everything," Bryn said. "Her reputation, her family, everything, and she did it knowing no one would ever know she was right." Sable did not answer. There was nothing to add. She heard the truck on the mountain road before she saw it, Stellan's engine, distinctive on the grade. She carried the letter to the front door and opened it, and stood on the porch in the cold morning air, holding the paper in both hands, waiting. Stellan came up the path from where he had parked. He took one look at her face and at what she was holding, and stopped walking. "You found them," he said. "She wasn't a thief," Sable said. "No," he said, "she never was." He came up onto the porch, and she gave him the letter, and he stood in the pale morning light and read it, and when he finished, he folded it with great care along its original creases, and held it for a long moment before handing it back. His eyes were dry, but there was something happening in his face that had the quality of a wall that has been standing for a very long time, beginning very slowly to come down. "She wrote that a long time ago," he said. "She's been waiting a long time for someone to come read it." "You knew all of it," Sable said. "I knew most of it, not all." He looked out at the tree line, at the place where the mountain rose above the clearing, at the sky that was beginning to show the first pale light of a winter sun. She made her choice. I made mine. I stayed near enough to help when she needed it, and far enough away to let her be what she had decided to be. Did you agree with what she decided? I was quiet for long enough that the answer, when it came, carried the weight of decades of consideration. "I agreed with her reasons," he said. "I spent 60 years wishing she hadn't had to make that choice at all. That's different from agreeing or disagreeing." He turned back to look at Sable. "The question now isn't what she decided then. The question is what you decide now." From inside the house came the sound of Roan standing up, his nails clicking on the floor, moving toward the door. Sable looked past Stellan at the tree line where the cigarette had burned the night before, and then she looked at her hands, which were still holding the letter, and she thought about Roe Forden sliding that business card across a desk in Brooklyn and taking it back again a fraction of a second too quickly. "Someone was watching the house last night," she said, "standing in the trees." Stellan nodded. He did not look surprised. "I know," he said. "That's the other reason I came early this morning." Silas Whitmore arrived at 7 in the morning with a toolbox in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. And the first thing he did when he stepped through the front door was look at the ceiling the way a man looks at it when he already knows what he is going to find. "She held up well," he said, "better than most. I was 70 years old and walked with a slight hitch in his right leg that he never mentioned and that no one who knew him well ever asked about. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 5 decades working wood, thick-knuckled and stained at the grain lines with something that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. Stellan had called him before dawn. Silas set his thermos on the kitchen table, looked at the 5 tin boxes still arranged on the floor where Sable had left them, and said nothing about them at all. He spent the first hour moving through the house, methodically pressing his palm against walls, looking up into corners, crouching to examine the joinery where the floor met the baseboards. Sable followed him partly to learn, and partly because watching a man who genuinely knew what he was doing had a calming effect on her that she hadn't expected to need this morning. In the back hallway, near the junction of 2 exterior walls, Silas stopped and crouched down. He worked his fingers under the edge of a floorboard and pulled up, gently exposing the subfloor beneath, Along the subfloor, spaced at regular intervals of exactly 6 feet, were a series of iron hooks, old and rusted to a deep brown, each one set into the wood with a precision that spoke of deliberate installation. "Folding bed mounts," Silas said. "You put a hook at both ends of a frame, fold it up against the wall during the day. Somebody had a lot of those in here at some point." Sable looked at the row of hooks, 10 of them that she could count. "She had people staying here," Stellan said from the doorway behind them. Silas nodded. "After the flood, there were families with nowhere to go. Some of them ended up in church basements, some with relatives. A few of them ended up here." He stood brushing dust from his knees. "I know at least 3 men in this county who spent their first weeks after the flood in this house. They didn't know who the woman was, only that she cooked breakfast in the morning and didn't ask questions." Sable looked down the hallway, trying to see it as it had been. 10 people sleeping on folding beds. A woman cooking oatmeal in the kitchen, feeding people whose relief funds were being routed into accounts they would never see. "She used what she could," Sable said, "to help the people the money was meant for." Silas picked up his toolbox. "Same thing she always did," he said simply. He moved toward the stairs without elaborating, because Silas Whitmore was a man who considered that a thing said correctly the first time did not benefit from being said again. They drove down to town at mid-morning, Stellan's truck taking the mountain road in a lower gear than the previous night's desperate descent. In daylight, the landscape revealed itself as something different from what the dark and rain had suggested. The forested ridges rolling away to the south and east with a kind of settled grandeur, the valley below showing the distant geometry of cultivated fields and the glint of a reservoir. The town of Blue Ridge proper was arranged around a courthouse square with a Civil War memorial at its center and a flag that needed replacing. The main street had the particular character of a place that had been prosperous once and had since learned to maintain itself without expecting growth. Hardware store, diner, post office, a pharmacy with a window display that hadn't changed in years. Vera Wick ran the post office the way some people run a small country, with complete command of all relevant information and a genuine affection for the population she served. She was 67 with silver hair wound into a bun so tight it looked structural, and she came around the counter when she saw Sable walk through the door with the decisive movement of someone who has been waiting for this moment. "Lord above," she said, taking both of Sable's hands, "you've got Mabel's eyes. I'd have known you anywhere." She held Sable's hands for a moment, studying her face with an attention that was not intrusive but complete. "Every Christmas for 50 years," Vera said. "She sent me a card, handmade pressed flower inside same as the year before. I have every one of them in a box at home." She paused and something shifted in her expression, becoming more serious. "I need to tell you something. 6 weeks before she passed, Mabel came in here with a package, large one, well wrapped. She wanted it sent to a law office in Richmond, and she asked me to personally record the tracking number and keep a copy of the receipt." Vera reached under the counter and produced a small envelope. "I've had this ready since I heard someone had inherited the property." Sable took the envelope. Inside was a receipt and a tracking confirmation, both dated 6 weeks earlier. She knew, Sable said. She prepared, Vera said, which was a different thing, and Vera knew the difference. She also told me something before she left. She said, "Vera, if anyone comes asking about me, tell them to find Amos Fenn." She held Sable's gaze. He's at Blue Ridge Elder Care. He doesn't have much time left, but his mind is still sharp." Sable folded the receipt into her jacket pocket and thanked Vera and walked back out into the pale autumn sunlight, where Stellan was waiting on the sidewalk with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the courthouse. "Amos Fenn," she said. Stellan turned. Something moved through his expression quickly, too quickly to read cleanly. "He was on the relief committee," he said, "in 1963. You knew him." "I know of him. He took a management position at Crow's quarry operation about a year after the flood. Stayed there for 30 years. He looked back at the courthouse. "Comfortable position, good salary, not a bad arrangement for a man who decided to stay quiet." They went to Blue Ridge Hardware. It was a corner building that smelled of machine oil and sawdust, and the particular mustiness of a place that had been selling useful things for a very long time. Bryn went immediately to a display of antique hand tools mounted on the wall, with explanatory cards, reading each one with the focused interest she brought to anything that represented a craft she hadn't encountered before. Fletcher Crow walked in 7 minutes after they did. I was 46, wearing a suit that cost more than most people in this county spent on clothing in a year, and he moved through the hardware store with the ease of a man who understood that every room he entered was in some fundamental way his. He was handsome in a careful way, the kind of handsome that requires maintenance, and knows it. His eyes found Sable across the store, and he came toward her with his hand already extended, the smile already arranged. "Miss Ashby," he said, "I heard you'd arrived. I wanted to welcome you personally to our community." Sable shook his hand. It was a firm handshake, professionally calibrated. "I understand you've been getting settled in," he said. "That old house requires significant work to bring up to current code. If you're finding the situation overwhelming, my father's company has a long-standing interest in that parcel. We could make this very simple for you." Sable looked at him steadily. "I found a ledger in the house," she said. "It lists 14 families who were supposed to receive relief funds in 1963. It also lists what they actually received, and I've spent this morning confirming that the land those 14 families lost is now held by Crow Development." Fletcher did not change expression. He was too practiced for that. But she watched something recalibrate behind his eyes, a rapid reassessment of what this conversation was and where it was going. "Historical property transactions are a matter of public record," he said. "Whatever your great-aunt may have documented represents one side of a complicated historical situation. Old grievances dressed up as evidence rarely hold up to scrutiny." His tone had not changed. It was still the tone of a reasonable man having a reasonable conversation. "I'd hate to see you damage your own position by making accusations you can't support." Sable said nothing. She simply waited. Fletcher glanced at Bryn, who was still examining the tool display, and appeared not to be listening, and back at Sable, and the glance was brief, but it was a calculation, and Sable felt the calculation as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. "Think about your daughter," he said quietly. "Think about what kind of stability you can actually offer her here, versus a clean sail and a fresh start somewhere that makes sense for a woman in your situation." He smiled once more professionally and left. Vera materialized at Sable's elbow a moment later. She had come in for hardware and had heard the last 30 seconds of the conversation. "The man standing by the door when Fletcher came in," Vera said quietly, "the one in the red flannel shirt. That's Clem Pruitt, former county sheriff. He retired 6 years ago, and nobody's quite sure what he does now, but when something in this county needs to be handled quietly, Clem Pruitt is the person the Crow family calls." She paused. "He was parked outside your property 2 days before you arrived." Sable looked at the door. Clem Pruitt had already gone. Big man 55 or so, with a stillness about him that she recognized now as the stillness of someone who has learned that watching without being watched is more useful than participating. The man from the gas station, the camouflage jacket, the slow, deliberate shake of his head. He had recognized her destination from the directions in her hand. He had already known who she was before she reached the mountain. She drove that knowledge down, kept her face neutral. There would be time to think about it later. Back at the house with the afternoon light coming flat through the windows, Sable went upstairs to Mabel's bedroom, while Stellan and Silas worked on the roof, and Breen explored the property with Rowan moving alongside her at the careful pace his arthritis required. The journal system Mabel had kept was extensive and organized, 30 years of daily entries, each volume labeled on the spine with a date range, arranged in strict chronological order on the bedroom shelves. Sable pulled one from 1968 and another from 1987 and sat on the edge of the bed, reading. Mabel's voice in the journals was dry and precise and occasionally funny in the way that people are funny when they have no audience and therefore no performance to maintain. She wrote about the weather and the birds and the progress of her garden with the same attentiveness she brought to everything, but she also wrote about the county below her, tracking it with the patience of a scientist observing a long-term experiment. The 1987 volume fell open near the middle to an entry in October. Sable read it once and then read it again. Vera mentioned that my son Hal has a daughter now, born in the spring. They named her Sable. That was all. 3 sentences. But the handwriting on those 3 sentences was different from the surrounding text, slightly larger, the letters less controlled, as though the hand that wrote them was not entirely steady. Mabel had known about her since she was born, had known her name, had chosen for 42 years to stay on the mountain and say nothing. Sable sat with that for a long time. She was still sitting when Bryn called from the hallway. "Mum, there's something wrong with this wall." The wall in question was in the upstairs hallway, between 2 bookcases that Sable had assumed were simply placed there for storage. Bryn was running her fingertips along a section of wood paneling, pressing lightly at intervals. "The grain doesn't match," Bryn said. "Look, this section, the lines run a different direction from the rest." Sable looked. The difference was subtle enough that she would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing, but Bryn was right. She pressed the panel. It moved with the specific resistance of something that operates on a mechanism. She ran her hand along the edge, and it was Bryn who found the release pressing a decorative knot in the wood until something clicked and the panel swung inward on well-oiled hinges into darkness. Stellan was on the roof when Sable called up to him. He came down the ladder and stood in the hallway, looking at the open panel with an expression that was neither surprised nor unsurprised, but something in between the expression of a man who had suspected something existed without knowing its exact location. The hidden room was 6 feet by 8 feet. One wall was shelving floor to ceiling, holding journals and document folders arranged in the same meticulous order as the bedroom shelves. The desk beneath the shuttered window was covered with something that took Sable a moment to understand. It was a map, hand-drawn on several sheets of drafting paper, taped together at the edges to form a single large document covering the entire surface of the desk and extending partway up the wall above it. It was a map of Blue Ridge County rendered in detail that spoke of years of careful work, every road and ridge and property line noted with precision. The properties were color-coded: blue for the original owners, the families who had lived on the land before the flood of 1963, red for the current ownership status of those same properties. Almost every blue marking had been overlaid with red, 14 originally, but the map went forward in time from 1963, tracking additional acquisitions through the decades, additional families pressured off additional land, the red spreading outward from the original 14 parcels in every direction. In the corner of the map in small neat letters was a date last updated September 2023, 2 months before Mabel died. Stellan stood at the desk, looking at the map for a long time without speaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was not entirely steady. "She never stopped," he said. 60 years. She never stopped watching them. On the desk beside the map was a photograph that Sable had not noticed at first. Two women, both young, standing in what appeared to be the yard outside this house. One of them was holding an infant. The other had her arms slightly extended, about to receive the child. Sable recognized the woman receiving the baby. She had seen that face in old family photographs for her entire life. It was her grandmother, the woman who had raised her father Hal and died when Sable was 12. The woman holding the baby was Mabel. She was perhaps 28 years old in the photograph, and her face in the moment before she transferred the child had an expression that Sable would think about for a long time afterward, without being able to name it precisely. It was the expression of a person making an irrevocable decision and knowing it. On the back of the photograph, in Mabel's handwriting, Mabel with her sister and baby, Hal. June 14, 1960. The hardest day. Sable stood very still. She looked at the photograph. She looked at Stellan, who had read the inscription over her shoulder and whose face was now doing something she had not seen it do before. She gave him to her sister, Sable said. She loved Hal, Stellan said. She would have given him everything, but she knew what was coming. She knew that when she took that money and disappeared, she would become the worst person anyone in this county had ever heard of. She couldn't let that touch him. Sable set the photograph down on the desk. Her hands were steady, but the steadiness was effortful. Hal had been her father. He had died believing he was his aunt's son by adoption, raised with love and never knowing the truth. He had died never knowing the woman on the mountain, never knowing the choice that had been made for him before he was old enough to have an opinion about it. She thought about the journal entry from 1987. Vera mentioned that my son Hal has a daughter now, born in the spring. They named her Sable. 42 years of knowing. 42 years of staying on the mountain and saying nothing. She had to go outside. She told Bryn she'd be back in a few minutes and went out the back door and stood in the cold afternoon air with her hands at her sides, looking at the cliff face that rose behind the house, the stone dark with moisture, a thin thread of water finding its way down from some source above. The question that kept arriving was not why Mabel had done what she did. The letter had explained the reasoning with a clarity that Sable found against her expectations entirely credible. The question was something harder than that. It was the question of what a person does with the knowledge that their entire sense of their own history has just changed shape. She stood there until Bryn appeared in the doorway behind her.
Mom?
I'm fine, I know, Bryn said, but come look at what I found in the journal from 1987. She had the journal open to the October entry. She pointed to the 3 sentences. She knew about you since you were born, Bryn said. She knew your name, and she still didn't come. I know. It wasn't because she didn't care. Bryn's voice was careful, 10 years old and somehow older. It says in the other entries that she promised herself she wouldn't disrupt the life Hal had built. She thought that was the only thing she had left to give him, leaving him alone. She looked at her mother. That's not coldness. That's a different kind of love, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back. Sable looked at her daughter. She thought that there were moments in parenthood that arrived without warning, moments when you understood that the child you were raising was going to exceed you in some important way, and that this was not a loss, but the entire point. The storm came in at dusk. It announced itself first as a change in the quality of the light, then as a wind that moved through the pines with a low, purposeful sound, then as rain that arrived suddenly and with force. Stellan and Silas, who had been finishing the roof work in the last hour of daylight, came down the ladder and into the house with the efficiency of men who had learned to read weather and act before it acted on them. By 8 o'clock the storm had reached the intensity of the previous night's weather, and by 9 it had exceeded it. The wind found every gap in the old structure and made itself known. A section of gutter tore loose on the north side and hammered against the exterior wall in an irregular rhythm. The generator flickered twice, but held. Rowan was the first to react. He had been lying near the hearth, and he stood up at 9:20, with his ears forward and his whole body oriented toward the back door, making his warning sound. Sable was at the kitchen table with Mabel's documents. She looked at him. He looked at the door. She went to the window above the sink and looked out into the storm. The yard was dark, the trees at the edge of the clearing barely visible through the rain. Nothing moved. She turned back to the kitchen. Rowan had not relaxed. Then Bryn said from behind her, "Where's Rowan?" Sable turned. The dog was not in the kitchen. He was not in the hallway. The back door was closed but not latched, moving slightly in a draught, and she understood what had happened before she reached it. The door swung open when she touched it. Cold air and rain poured through. Rowan was gone. Bryn was behind her in seconds, her raincoat already in her hand. He ran. The wind probably scared him. He doesn't go far when he's scared, he just... Bryn! But Bryn was already through the door. What followed was the kind of fear that operates below thought. Sable grabbed her own coat and a flashlight and went out into the storm, calling her daughter's name into the wind, which took her voice and distributed it sideways, making it available to no one. Stellan was through the door 30 seconds behind her, and 40 seconds after that his phone was connecting to Leif Covington, who answered on the second ring. They spread out from the house in a pattern that Stellan directed with brief clear instructions, each person taking a specific sector, the flashlight beams cutting through the rain at different angles. With Stellan were 2 other men who had arrived in Leif's truck, one of them a combat engineer named Tommy Briggs, who immediately asked 2 questions about the terrain that established he was thinking about it in a way that was going to be useful. Tommy looked at the slope behind the house, looked at the direction of the visible drainage channels, calculated water accumulation, and then said the creek. If she ran toward the sound of water, that's where she went. How was correct. They found Bryn and Roan together at the base of the massive oak that stood at the property's eastern boundary, where the creek had transformed itself in the past 3 hours from a manageable stream into something that had no patience for boundaries. The water was dark and fast and high. The lower roots of the oak were already submerged. Bryn was 8 feet up the tree, her left arm around the trunk, and her right arm around Rowan, who had stopped struggling and was holding himself very still against her, with the focused cooperation of an old dog who understood the situation better than his instincts were comfortable with. Mom, Bryn called. Her voice was steady. The steadiness of it cost her something, but she maintained it. Rowan ran and I followed, and then the water came up so fast. Stellan did not hesitate. He uncoiled the rope from his belt and had it around a nearby tree, in a configuration that would hold even if the ground gave way. He handed Sable the near end. "Hold this," he said, "both hands. Don't let go for any reason." He went out to the tree with the focused, unhurried movement of a man who had done things in worse conditions than this, and understood that speed and panic were not the same thing. He reached Bryn and secured the rope around her waist before he reached for Rowan, taking the dog against his own body with one arm and talking to Bryn in a low, continuous voice that Sable could not hear over the water. They came down slowly. Bryn moved with the rope as a guide. Stellan below her, Rowan held against him with the specific, careful grip of someone who has carried injured things before. They were almost to the ground when the bank gave way. A section of earth 3 feet wide simply departed from itself and fell into the water, taking Stellan's footing with it. He went sideways and down his hand, releasing Bryn's arm as he went, and for one moment that Sable would remember for the rest of her life, he was moving toward the water with nothing between him and it. The rope went taut. Sable did not think about it. Her hands had already locked, and her weight was already back her heels, finding purchase in the wet earth, and she pulled with everything she had, and Leif was behind her, adding his weight to hers, and the rope held and Stellan stopped. I was an inch from the water's edge, maybe 2. Leif and Tommy hauled on the rope, and Stellan came back from the edge, and Bryn grabbed his outstretched arm with both hands, and they collapsed together onto higher ground, all 4 of them, with Rowan landing on top of the heap and immediately beginning to shake himself dry, with complete disregard for the circumstances. They lay there for a moment in the rain, breathing. Bryn spoke first. "You saved us, Mr. Granger. We saved each other," Stellan said. He was looking at the sky, his chest rising and falling. "That's the only kind of saving that works." They got back to the house, wet and cold, and got a fire going, and got dry clothes, and got Rowan toweled off, and it was while Sable was wringing out her jacket over the kitchen sink that she noticed the drawer. The second drawer from the top, the one where Mabel had kept her correspondence. It was pulled out 2 inches farther than she had left it. She looked at it. She looked at the papers on the kitchen table, and then looked more carefully and saw that the order was different, not dramatically, but different enough. She checked the desk in the sitting room. A folder had been moved. She checked the back hallway closet where she had stored the document boxes. 2 of the tin boxes from the hidden panel were there, 3 were not. On the kitchen table, which had been clear when she left, there was a piece of paper. It had been placed there, deliberately, not dropped. The handwriting was blocky and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who wanted to be readable and wanted to be remembered. "We know there are 5 boxes. We found 3. You have 2 left. Last chance to make this easy. C.P." Clem Pruitt had been in the house while they were in the storm searching for Breen and Ron. He had taken 3 of the boxes. He had left a note by choice because he wanted her to know it was him, because the Crow family wanted her to understand that the walls of this house were not a protection against them and never had been. Sable read the note twice. She set it back on the table. What remained was the letter Mabel had written to her, which she had folded into her jacket pocket on the first morning and had not put back. And in the hidden room upstairs behind the panel that Clem Pruett had either not found or had not had time to open, Mabel's complete map of 60 years of property acquisitions remained on the desk. Stellan came into the kitchen and looked at the note. He read it and set it down. He had time to get in and out during the storm, he said, while we were all in the woods. He took the most obvious evidence, Sable said, the things a lay person would immediately recognize as significant, but not everything. No. Stellan was quiet for a moment. Then Amos Fenn kept his own records, separate from Mabel's. Different perspective, different documentation. If Pruett doesn't know about Amos, Vera told me to find him, Sable said. Then we go tomorrow. He looked at the note one more time, then at Sable, and in his face she saw something that had been present since the first morning, but had been moving gradually toward the surface, the expression of a man who has been carrying a debt for a very long time and has finally understood how to begin repaying it. She did not sleep again that night without dreaming of the water and of what an inch of distance actually means. The next morning they drove to Blue Ridge Elder Care in Stellan's truck, Bryn in the back seat, with Rowan's head in her lap, the county road winding through the valley with the particular clarity that follows a heavy storm, every surface rinsed and defined. Blue Ridge Elder Care occupied a former school building on the county's eastern edge, the institutional geometry of its original purpose, softened by planted beds of late-season chrysanthemums and a porch with wooden rocking chairs facing the mountain view. The lobby smelled of institutional cleaning products and something warmer underneath coffee and the particular mustiness of old upholstered furniture. The woman at the nursing station was in her mid-30s, with the efficient manner of someone who has learned to manage information flow as part of her professional identity. Her name tag said Gwen. "Mr. Fenn isn't available for visitors today," she said. Stellan looked at her with the measured patience of a man who has dealt with obstacles considerably more substantial than a nursing station. "He's expecting us," he said. "We confirmed this morning." "I'm sorry, but Mr. Fenn's schedule—" Stellan took out his phone and called Amos Fenn's room number, which Vera had provided. The phone rang twice in the hallway behind Gwen's position. Then a voice answered, reedy but clear, and Stellan held the phone toward Gwen so she could hear Amos Fenn say, "Send them in." Gwen stepped aside, but as Sable passed the station she felt the woman's attention follow her in a way that had nothing to do with routine observation, not idle curiosity. Assessment. Amos Fenn's room was at the end of the east wing private, with a window that looked out toward the ridge, where on a clear day you could probably see the upper slopes of Hollow Creek. He was 81 years old, and the illness had reduced him in the specific way that pancreatic cancer reduces a person quickly and without negotiation, so that the man in the bed was considerably smaller than the man who had lived his working life at Culver Crow's quarry for 30 years. But his eyes, when he looked at Sable, were fully present, fully awake, and carrying something that had been there for a long time. "You're Mabel Weston's great-niece," he said. He used her birth name, the name she had carried before she vanished into the mountains, and became a legend. The girl from Brooklyn. Sable Ashby, she said, that's right. Amos looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached under the mattress, which required an effort, and produced a small leather notebook, its cover worn smooth and dark from decades of handling. I kept this, he said. Everything, every meeting, every number, every decision made in rooms that weren't supposed to have records. His hands trembled slightly, but his grip on the notebook was certain. I told myself I kept it as protection if Crow ever turned on me, but that was a lie I told myself. He looked at Sable directly, without flinching. I kept it because some part of me knew that a day would come when I would have to account for what I did and didn't do. I just didn't know who I would account to. He held the notebook out. Sable took it. There's something else, Amos said. Culver kept his own records. Everything. His personal copies of every transaction, every shell company structure, every arrangement. He kept it as leverage over the other men involved, insurance against betrayal. He paused to breathe. I watched him lock it in a private safe at his house in 1971. I don't know if it's still there, but if it is, it contains everything that Clem Pruitt took from your house last night, and considerably more. Sable looked at him. How do you know about last night? Amos almost smiled. This county is not as large as it imagines itself to be. He settled back against his pillow. I've been a coward for 60 years, Miss Ashby. Comfortable silence, a good salary, the particular cowardice of a man who told himself that staying quiet was the same as staying out of it. His voice was even and without self-pity, which was worse somehow than self-pity would have been. I hope what I'm giving you is worth something. I'm running short of time to make it worth something different. Sable stood to go, and as she moved toward the door, a voice came from the hallway just outside a conversation between two people who had not realized she was about to emerge. One voice she did not recognize, the other was Fletcher Crow. She stopped. She looked back at Stellan, who had heard it too. They stood in the room for a moment, perfectly still, while the conversation in the hallway moved away toward the lobby. Stellan looked at Sable. He came to see how Amos is doing, he said. He came to see if Amos talked to us, Sable said. Stellan nodded once. On the way back to the truck passing Gwen's station, Sable noticed that Gwen's screen had a document open that she was moving to minimize too quickly for it to have been a natural action. The visible portion of the document for the half-second it was visible showed a header that Sable recognized because she had seen it before on a business card in a banker's drawer in Brooklyn. Crow Development Corp. She said nothing. She got into the truck and closed the door and sat with the leather notebook in her lap and Amos Fenn's account of 6 decades of silence. She opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise, and the first entry was dated July 14, 1963, 3 weeks before the flood. In the parking lot, a young man was waiting beside Stellan's truck. He was about 32, wearing jeans and a dark blue sweater, and he had the bone structure of the Crow family, which was not something you could mistake once you had seen Fletcher. But where Fletcher wore his presence like a statement, this young man stood with his hands in his pockets and his eyes carrying something that looked less like the family confidence and more like the family weight. Miss Ashby, he said, I'm Knox Crow, Culver's grandson. Stellan went still beside Sable. I'm not here because of my grandfather, Knox said. I'm here because my grandfather is dying, and because when I was in law school, I found a copy of Amos Fenn's original testimony, the testimony he never delivered, and I've spent 6 years trying to figure out what to do with what I know." He paused. "I think I've run out of time to keep figuring." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a key, small brass, the kind that opens a fireproof safe. He held it out. "The safe in my grandfather's study," he said. "I've had this copy for 2 years. He doesn't know." He looked at Sable with the steady look of someone who has made a decision and is past the point of reconsidering it. "Everything Clem Pruitt took from your house last night is in that safe, along with 30 years of additional documentation that Pruitt doesn't know exists." Sable looked at the key. She looked at Knox Crow, grandson of the man who had destroyed Mabel's life, standing in a parking lot in the rain, offering her the means to finish what Mabel had started. She took the key. Stellan, beside her, said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Knox with the direct assessment he gave to situations that required honesty rather than courtesy. "You understand what this does to your family's name," Stellan said. "I know what my family's name was built on," Knox said. "I've known for 6 years. The name was already what it was. I'm just deciding what mine is going to be." The night before the commemoration, Fletcher Crow called at 11 o'clock. Sable was sitting at Mabel's kitchen table, with Amos Fenn's notebook open in front of her, and Knox's key on the wood beside it, and when the phone rang she looked at the screen for a moment before answering. Fletcher did not begin with pleasantries this time. He had moved past that particular instrument. "Miss Sieski." "Ashby," he said, "I know what Knox gave you in that parking lot. My son made a serious mistake that he does not yet fully understand, and I am telling you now as clearly as I know how to say it, that what you are planning to do tomorrow will not accomplish what you think it will accomplish." His voice was even controlled, the voice of a man who has prepared what he intends to say. "I can make the next several years of your life extremely difficult. The county inspector has already been briefed on structural concerns at the Hollow Creek property. Your daughter's enrollment status at any school in this district is a matter that falls within administrative discretion, and your credibility as someone arriving from out of state with a family grievance and a box of 60-year-old documents is not by any objective measure going to hold up against the reputation this family has built in this community." He paused to let that settle. "Think about Breen," he said. "Think about what stability you can actually give her here and what you're trading it for." Sable listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When he finished, the silence on the line lasted exactly long enough for him to understand that she had made her decision before he called. "Mr. Crow," she said, "you threatened a 10-year-old girl to protect money your grandfather stole from flood victims 60 years ago. I think that tells both of us everything we need to know about who is actually without a foundation here." She ended the call. Her hands were not steady when she set the phone down. She sat with that for a moment, allowing it. Then she picked up Amos's notebook and continued reading. Stellan arrived at 6 the next morning. He knocked twice and came in without waiting, which was a thing he had started doing somewhere in the past week, the knock a courtesy rather than a request. He was dressed differently than Sable had seen him before. Pressed khaki trousers, a dark blue button-down shirt, and on the left breast of his jacket 3 rows of service ribbons that she had not seen him wear until this morning. They were not decorative, they were a statement of record. He set a paper bag of pastries on the kitchen table and looked at Knox's key, which was still there. "Leaf and Tommy are already in town," he said. "2 others are driving down from Roanoke. They'll be at the community center before the opening remarks." "How many?" "11, maybe 12." He poured himself coffee from the pot Sable had already made. Men who were there, men who remember what the county looked like before Culver Crow decided it was his to arrange. Sable looked at him. "You organized all of this." "I made some calls," he said. "People made their own decisions." Bryn came downstairs at 6:30 with her hair braided and Mabel's original ledger held against her chest, the way she carried things she considered important. She had been awake, Sable understood, for some time before that. She set the ledger on the table beside the pastry bag and looked at her mother and Stellan with the expression she wore when she had thought something through and arrived at a conclusion. "I want to read the letter," she said. "At the ceremony, if there's a moment, I want to read the part that Mabel wrote to Hal." Sable looked at her daughter. "She wrote it for him to read," Bryn said. "He never got to. Someone should read it, someone who shares his blood." Stellan was very still at the other end of the table. "All right," Sable said. The community center on the county's main road had been decorated for the occasion with the particular festive seriousness of a small town that takes its history personally. Photographs of the flood lined the entrance hallway. Large prints showing the valley submerged houses broken against bridge abutments, families standing in mud with everything they owned piled behind them. The exhibition had been arranged with care, and whoever arranged it had not softened the images. The parking lot was full by 9 in the morning. Cars from neighboring counties, a van from a Roanoke television station, 2 reporters Sable did not recognize standing near the entrance with notebooks. Renstoro, 68 years old and carrying a canvas bag stuffed with folders, found Sable near the entrance and shook her hand without ceremony. "I have my original reporting notes from 1963, Ren said. "Every interview I conducted before the editor told me to drop the story. Names, dates, direct quotes from families who told me they had received nothing from the committee, while committee members were telling the press that distribution was proceeding normally." She looked at the photographs on the wall. "I should have fought harder to get it published. I didn't. I've had a long time to think about that." "You're here now," Sable said. "I'm here now," Wren agreed in a tone that accepted this as partial but not sufficient. Inside the hall was arranged with rows of folding chairs facing a low stage. A podium stood at the center with the Blue Ridge County seal. The program listed 4 speakers, a minister opening with a prayer, the current mayor offering historical context, a representative from the State Historical Society, and then listed last, and with the largest font, Culver Crow, who had served as an honorary chairman of the commemoration committee for the past 20 years. Culver was already in the hall when Sable arrived. He was 79 years old, and age had compacted him without diminishing the quality of attention he directed at the room. He walked with a polished walnut cane, moving among attendees with the particular ease of a man who had spent decades understanding that authority does not require announcement. People came to him, they always had. He saw Sable from across the room. He did not look away. He began moving toward her with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided that direct engagement serves better than avoidance. He stopped close enough that his voice would not carry beyond the 2 of them. "I know what you have in that bag," he said. He looked at the leather portfolio under her arm with the calm of a man assessing a problem he has encountered before. "I've been managing inconvenient documents for 60 years. A woman and her daughter, and an old soldier, and a dying man's notebook are not going to accomplish what you think they're going to accomplish. Sable looked at him directly. He was taller than she had expected, and his eyes were sharp and cold, and experienced the eyes of a man who had made difficult decisions for a long time and had not been troubled by them. Mabel Weston lived alone on that mountain for 60 years, Sable said. She woke up every morning in a house where she was the most hated person in this county because she refused to let you have what you tried to steal from people who had already lost everything. She watched from that ridge while you built your empire on their grief, and she documented every piece of it. Sable kept her voice level and her eyes on his. How did you sleep, Mr. Crow, all those years? How did you actually sleep? Culver's jaw tightened 1 degree, barely perceptible. She made her choice, he said. Yes, Sable said. She did, and now I'm making mine. Culver turned and walked toward the stage without responding, and Sable watched him go and noted that his grip on the cane had changed, the knuckles lighter against the dark wood. The ceremony opened as scheduled. The minister's prayer was dignified and general. The mayor's historical remarks were careful and correct, and managed to describe the flood and its aftermath without mentioning the relief committee's financial operations in any way that would cause discomfort. The State Historical Society representative talked about resilience as a regional characteristic. Then Culver Crow took the podium. He spoke well. That was the first thing. He had been giving this speech in various forms for 2 decades, and it had the polish of material that has been refined through repetition. He spoke about community, about the way neighbors had come together in the worst of it, about the volunteers who had given their time and resources to the recovery effort. He spoke in the first-person plural we and our and together, the grammar of collective endeavor. Sable was in the 3rd row. She had not planned what happened next. It came from Bryn, who had been sitting with the ledger in her lap, and whose hand went into the air before Sable had registered the movement. The hall had the kind of attentive quiet that large gatherings produce when a familiar voice is speaking familiar things. Bryn's raised hand was visible from the stage. Culver paused. A woman from the County Historical Society, seated near the front, interpreted the raised hand as part of the scheduled student presentation and nodded encouragingly. Do you have a question, young lady? Bryn stood. She was 10 years old, and she was not nervous. Sable had not known, until this moment, how much of Mabel was in her daughter's posture when she decided something mattered. I have information, Bryn said, from my great-great-aunt's journals and financial records. The records showed that the Relief Committee in 1963 diverted funds intended for flood victims into private accounts and shell companies. 14 families who were supposed to receive assistance received nothing, and their land was subsequently purchased at below market value by committee members. She looked at Culver Crow without wavering. My great-great-aunt Mabel Weston did not steal the relief funds. She removed them from the control of the men who were already stealing them. The hall did not erupt. It stilled, which was a different thing and louder in its way. Culver looked at this 10-year-old child, and in his face was something that had not been there before, something that looked less like anger than like a man watching a wall he built a very long time ago beginning to move. Children often misunderstand complex historical situations, he said, and his voice was still controlled, still the public voice. Perhaps your mother could clarify that these are family stories without factual basis. Sable was already standing. She walked to the stage with the leather portfolio in her hand, and she did not look at Fletcher, who was moving toward her from the left side of the room, because she did not need to see what Leif Covington and Tommy Briggs would do when Fletcher got close enough. She set the portfolio on the podium beside Breen and looked out at the hall. "My name is Sable Ashby," she said. "Mabel Weston was my great-aunt. I arrived in Blue Ridge County 2 weeks ago, and I found what she had been keeping for 60 years because she knew that eventually someone would come who could do something with it. I'm going to walk you through that documentation now." Ze began. She started with the ledger. She read 4 entries, 4 families, the amounts allocated, and the amounts received. The difference was not subtle. Then she set the ledger down and produced copies of the property transfer records that she and Wren had pulled from the county archives, the 14 parcels, the transfer dates, the prices paid, the current ownership under Crow Development. Then Wren Storrow walked to the front of the room without being asked and stood beside the podium. "My name is Wren Storrow," she said. "I reported for this paper for 31 years. In August of 1963, I interviewed 11 families who told me they had received nothing from the Relief Committee despite the committee's public statements. My editor was instructed to kill the story. I was told that the Crow family's advertising accounts would be withdrawn if the article ran." She reached into her canvas bag and produced a folder. "These are my original interview notes. Every one of these families gave me their names and their accounts on the record. I have carried these notes for 60 years, waiting for a moment when they would be useful." The room was very quiet. Knox Crow stood up from his seat in the 4th row. He had come in quietly and sat down quietly and said nothing, and Fletcher had not seen him until now. Fletcher moved toward the stage again, and this time his voice was not controlled. "Knox, sit down, right now." Knox looked at his father. The distance between them was perhaps 20 feet, and across that distance something passed that was not quite grief and not quite resolution, but contained both. "No," Knox said. He reached into his jacket and produced a document folder, walked to the stage and set it on the podium. "This is a copy of the contents of my grandfather's private safe," he said. 30 years of internal documentation of the transactions that Sable Ashby has described. My grandfather kept these records as leverage against the other men involved in the original diversion." He looked at Fletcher, who had stopped moving. "I've had a copy of his safe key for 2 years. I've known what's in it for 6 years, and I'm done pretending that staying quiet is the same as staying out of it." The last phrase landed in the room with a weight that Sable recognized from Amos Fenn's voice in the elder care facility. Knox had read the same words somewhere along the way. He had taken them in and made them his own. Fletcher stood in the aisle, very still, and for a moment he looked less like the man in the tailored suit from the hardware store and more like someone who has just understood that a structure he believed permanent has been standing on ground that was never solid. Clem Pruitt rose from his seat near the back of the hall. He was a large presence, and he used it, beginning to move toward the stage with the unhurried authority of a man accustomed to ending situations by entering them. Vera Wick stepped directly into his path. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and had run the post office for 31 years, and she stood in front of Clem Pruitt with her phone held up and her voice entirely steady. "Clem," she said, "I have photographs of the cigarette butt found next to the propane tank at the Ashby property. I have the tracking receipt for the package Mabel Weston sent to Richmond 6 weeks before her death, which establishes a chain of custody for the documentation now in this room, and I sent copies of everything I have to 3 newspapers this morning. She did not lower the phone. Sit down. Clem Pruitt looked at the phone, looked at Vera, looked at the television camera in the back of the room which was recording. He sat down. What followed was not a dramatic unraveling. It was quieter and more final than that. An elderly man named Gerald Hartwell, seated near the window, stood up without being called upon. He was perhaps 80 years old, and he had the careful deliberateness of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something and wants to say it correctly. "My father built a house on Sycamore Creek Road," Gerald said. "The flood took it in August of 1963. My father applied for relief funds 3 times and received nothing. He borrowed money from Culver Crow's bank to rebuild at a rate he could not sustain. He lost the property in Tixix." He looked at Culver Crow, who was still standing at the podium, his hand on the cane, his face the color of old paper. Culver Crow bought that property in 1966 for 40 cents on the dollar. He developed it into the shopping center that currently sits on that land. Gerald's voice did not waver. "My father died in a rental apartment in 1978. He never understood why the help that was promised never came." Culver Crow opened his mouth. What was available to him, all the words that had served him for 60 years, the reassurance and the reframing and the confident dismissal, none of it arrived. He stood at the podium and said nothing, and the nothing was the most complete answer he had ever given. Culver had a stroke 4 weeks after the commemoration. He was admitted to Blue Ridge Elder Care to a room in the East Wing, 3 doors from the room where Amos Fenn had spent his last weeks. Amos had died 2 weeks before Culver arrived peacefully in the early morning with his notebook no longer under his mattress because it was no longer his to carry. The last time Sable heard about Culver, he was able to walk the hallway with a walker and preferred to do so in the mornings. The nursing staff said he was quiet. He had stopped receiving visitors other than Knox, who came on Sundays. Fletcher resigned as county attorney before the state investigation formally opened. He did not contest the resignation. He moved to Roanoke. Whether father and son spoke regularly, Sable did not know. The state investigation took 8 months and produced a report that was careful in its language and unambiguous in its conclusions. Knox worked with investigators throughout the process, providing the safe's documentation and his own legal analysis of the corporate structures his grandfather had used. It was painstaking work, and it was not glamorous, and Knox did it anyway, methodically, the way you do a thing when doing it is the only honest option. 14 families or their descendants were identified. The compensation process was complicated because 60 years had passed, and land values had changed, and some families had moved away, and some had died. Knox established a trust from his portion of the family holdings specifically to address the original 14 cases. He said in the statement he gave the Historical Society that a complete accounting was not possible, and that this was part of what corruption costs, the permanent arithmetic of harm that cannot be fully corrected. But he did what could be done. The house on Hollow Creek Road became something neither Sable nor Mabel had planned. It happened gradually. Silas Whitmore finished the structural repairs in December, and while he worked, he built display cases along one wall of the main room, solid walnut frames for Mabel's journals, and the original ledger, and the map from the hidden room, which was now framed under glass. Vera donated the 50 years of Christmas cards, each one with its pressed flower. Wren donated her original interview notes, protected in archival sleeves. People began coming, not in large numbers at first. An older woman who had known Mabel by reputation and wanted to see the house for herself. A man whose grandmother had been one of the 14 families. A high school history teacher from the next county who had heard about the commemoration and wanted to bring a class. Silas built more display cases. Leif Covington and Tommy Briggs converted 2 upstairs rooms into meeting space. A wood stove was installed in the back room, which was where people tended to gather after formal visits around the warmth talking. Bryn appointed herself the guide. She had, over the 3 months since their arrival, developed an understanding of the property's history that was more complete than most adults who had lived in the county their whole lives. She could explain the ledger entries and the property map and the timeline of events with the directness of someone who has learned something because it matters, not because it was assigned. The school groups responded to her in a way they did not always respond to adults, because she was one of them in age and something else in what she had seen. She told the story the same way every time, without dramatics, beginning at the beginning and going through to the end. She told it the way Mabel had kept the ledger, with fidelity to what was true and without embellishment, because the truth was sufficient. She had started keeping her own journal in November, sitting at Mabel's desk in the evenings after visitors had gone writing in the same small, precise hand that the old desk seemed designed to produce. One evening in February, with snow on the ground outside and Ron asleep under the desk and a fire going in the main room where Stellan and Silas were arguing companionably about the best way to repair a section of exterior siding, Sable found Bryn at the desk and asked what she was writing. Bryn showed her the page without hesitation. She had written she kept the ledger so that someone would know what actually happened. She kept it for 60 years, which is longer than most people keep anything. She did not keep it for recognition. She kept it because the alternative was to let the record be what other people said it was. I think that is the most important thing I have learned in Blue Ridge County, that the record does not keep itself. Someone has to do it. Sable read it twice. Then she handed the journal back. The evening of the official opening of what they had decided to call the Mabel Weston Learning Center in the first week of March was cold and clear and attended by more people than the parking area could comfortably hold. Knox Crow came. Wren Storrow came with her granddaughter. Vera arrived early and stayed late. Gerald Hartwell brought his son, who was in his 50s and had grown up with the family story. Amos Fenn's daughter came from Charlottesville and stood for a long time in front of the display case that held his notebook, the one he had kept under his mattress for decades, which was now exhibited beside a short biographical note that Stellan had written. The note described Amos as a man who had made a serious mistake and spent 60 years knowing it, and who at the end of his life had decided that the knowing was not sufficient and that doing something about it was the only honest way to finish. Amos's daughter read the note twice and then turned to Sable and said he would have agreed with that description. He would have hated how accurate it is. Sable thought that was probably the right way to remember him. The last speaker of the evening was not scheduled. Stellan had not planned to speak. But at the end of the formal portion, when the mayor had said his piece and Wren had read briefly from her original 1963 interview notes, Stellan stood up from his chair in the back row. I was wearing the service ribbons again. He stood with the particular posture of someone who has straightened up out of habit, not out of performance. I knew Mabel Weston for most of my life, he said. I didn't do right by her when it would have counted. I stayed near enough to help when she needed practical things, and I told myself that was enough. And it wasn't. He looked at the display cases along the wall, the journals in their walnut frames, the map under glass, 50 years of pressed flowers. What she did required a kind of courage that I don't think I fully understood while she was alive. The courage to be wrong in public for the sake of being right in private. The courage to keep a record that no one could see for a purpose she could not be certain would ever arrive. He stopped for a moment. I want to say this clearly, because I did not say it to her when I could have. She was right. She was right about all of it, and she knew she was right, and she kept going anyway alone for 60 years without recognition or company or any reasonable certainty that it would matter in the end. He looked at Sable and then at Breen. It mattered. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Breen stood up at the front and opened the letter, the one Mabel had written to Hal, the one that had waited unsealed in the desk drawer for decades. She read it in the same voice she used to give tours, direct and clear, without performance. My beloved son, by the time you read this, you will have learned the difficult truth of your origins. I pray that the knowledge brings understanding rather than pain. Know that giving you to my sister was the hardest choice I ever made, but also the only one I could live with. When I stood against corruption, I knew they would destroy everything I loved in retribution. I could weather their attacks on my character, my livelihood, even my safety, but I could not bear to see you suffer for my decisions. Your aunt loved you as her own from the first moment. In every way that matters, she was your mother. My role was simply to bring you into this world and ensure you had the chance to grow beyond the shadow of scandal. I have watched you from a distance all these years, seen you grow, graduate, marry. My heart soared with each achievement. If you choose to seek me out after reading this, I will welcome that chance with an open heart. If you choose to leave the past buried, I will understand that too. Either way, know that you have been loved completely by two mothers, one who raised you and one who surrendered that privilege to protect you. With eternal love, your mother, Mabel. Stellan in the back row bowed his head. Leif Covington, beside him, placed his hand on Stellan's shoulder and left it there. Gerald Hartwell, who was 80 years old and had not cried at the commemoration in October and had not cried when the state investigation report was released, put his face in his hands. After the visitors had gone after Silas, and Leif had put the extra chairs away, and Vera had packaged up the remaining food after Knox had shaken Sable's hand at the door with the particular gravity of someone who has done a hard thing and knows it is not finished, but is at least begun. Sable walked through the empty rooms of the house alone. She moved slowly, the way you move through a space when you are trying to feel it rather than just see it. The display cases reflected the lamplight. Mabel's handwriting was visible through the glass of the journal frames, row after row of small, precise letters, the record kept faithfully across decades that had asked a great deal in return for very little. She stopped in front of the map. 60 years of watching, the blue markings and the red ones, the original 14 and all the parcels that followed the patient documentation of an empire built on other people's loss. She had looked at this map many times since the morning she and Bryn found it in the hidden room, but she looked at it now differently than she had before, understanding it as the work of a specific kind of love, the love that does not ask to be seen, but does not stop seeing. She went to the back room where the wood stove was still warm, and sat in the chair that had been Mabel's, the one that faced the window, the one where you could see the cliff face and on clear days the ridge above it. Rowan came in and lay down at her feet with the settled permanence of a dog who has decided that this floor is his floor, a decision he had apparently made within the first week of their arrival, and had not revisited. She sat there for a while with no particular thoughts, just the quiet and the warmth and the sound of Stellan's voice from somewhere in the house talking to Silas about the siding in the way they talked about everything practically and with good humor, two old men who had decided that useful work in the company of someone they respected was about as good as it got. Bryn appeared in the doorway. She was carrying her journal, and she looked at her mother with the expression she wore when she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." Mabel kept the ledger for 60 years before anyone could use it. She didn't know when someone would come. She didn't know if someone would come. Bryn leaned against the doorframe, but she kept it anyway, because keeping it was the right thing regardless of whether it worked out. "Yes," Sable said. "I want to keep my journal the same way," Bryn said. "Not because something will happen with it, just because the record matters, even if nobody reads it." Sable looked at her daughter, thought about the photograph of Mabel holding Hal in 1960 about the 3 sentences in the 1987 journal entry about 50 years of Christmas cards with pressed flowers that had traveled down a mountain road every December, regardless of whether anyone on the receiving end truly understood what they meant. "She would have liked you," Sable said. "She would have understood you." Bryn thought about this seriously, the way she thought about things that mattered. "I think I would have understood her too," she said. "I think I kind of do already." She went back upstairs to the desk, to the journal, to the work of keeping the record. In the spring, when the snow came off the ridge and the creek returned to its normal dimensions, and the first indigo buntings arrived at the feeder that Sable had hung from the oak branch in the side yard, she was standing at the kitchen window with coffee when Stellan came in and stood beside her. They watched the bunting work the feeder in silence for a moment. "She used to describe them to me in the letters," Stellan said. "The color. She said it was the kind of blue that made you feel like the color was a sound rather than a sight." Sable looked at the bird. It was intensely, specifically blue, the blue of something that has no business being that color, and is it anyway. "Tell me something she said to you," Sable said. "Something you haven't told anyone." Stellan was quiet for long enough that the bunting finished at the feeder and flew back into the trees. "The last time I saw her," he said, "about 3 years ago, I came up to fix the generator, and she made tea, and we sat on the porch. She was 85, sharp as she'd always been." He paused. "She said, 'Stellan, the thing I regret most is not the hard choices. The hard choices were necessary. What I regret is not saying out loud to anyone that I knew I was right. I kept the evidence, I kept the record, but I never said out loud, I know what I did, and I know why, and I was right to do it.' She said, 'That silence cost me more than all the rest of it.'" The kitchen was quiet. "She was right," Sable said. "She was always right," Stellan said. "That was the thing about her." He poured himself coffee and went out to look at the siding, because there was work to do, and Stellan Granger was a man who, when there was work to do, went and did it. Sable stood at the window a moment longer, watching the place where the bunting had been. On the mantel in the main room she had placed two photographs side by side. One was the old image of Mabel holding Hal in 1960, her sister's hands reaching to receive him. The other was a photograph Breen had taken in November, the day after the commemoration of Sable, and Stellan, standing on the front porch of the house with the mountain behind them, Roan at their feet, the morning light coming in at an angle that made the old wood of the house look almost golden. Mabel was in both photographs in different ways. The house kept its records. The mountain kept its silence. The creek ran below, carrying what the storm had brought down and what the season had given it, moving steadily in the direction it had always moved. And upstairs at the desk by the window, a 10-year-old girl wrote in a journal that no one had asked her to keep in a small, precise hand. She had not been taught the record of things she had seen and understood, adding her pages to all the pages that had come before. Mabel Weston, 1930 to 2023. She kept the ledger for 60 years. The truth kept itself.